Hello there, sweetheart. Come on now, get yourself nice and cozy under those blankets. Pull them up close. That's it. Are you comfortable? Good. You all settled in? Perfect. Tonight, I've got quite the story for you. And when I say quite the story, I mean it. We're talking passion that defied empires, power plays that would make modern politicians blush, terrible decisions made for love, drama that would fill a dozen soap operas. This is the story of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Now, you've probably heard the names before. Everyone has. But let me tell you what really happened. Not the sanitized version they teach in schools. The real story. The messy, complicated, absolutely fascinating truth about two people who loved each other so much they were willing to lose everything. Pour yourself some tea if you want, or just close your eyes and listen to the fire crackle. Get comfortable. We're going back over 2,000 years to a time when the Mediterranean world was young and empires rose and fell like the tide. Picture it with me. Ancient Egypt. The Nile River winding through the desert like a silver ribbon, bringing life to an otherwise barren land. Palm trees swaying in that hot, dry breeze, date palms heavy with fruit, fields of wheat stretching to the horizon. And Alexandria. Oh, my dear, Alexandria was something special. The greatest city in the ancient world, white marble buildings gleaming under the relentless Egyptian sun. The famous lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders, guiding ships into the harbor from miles away. Streets lined with columns and statues, gardens bursting with flowers you've never seen. The air filled with a dozen different languages as merchants from Greece, Arabia, Persia, even India crowded the marketplaces. And the library, the great library of Alexandria. 500,000 scrolls, the collected knowledge of the entire ancient world, all gathered in one place. Scholars came from everywhere to study there, to read, to debate, to push the boundaries of human knowledge. This was the world Cleopatra was born into, a world of learning and luxury, but also one of danger and political intrigue. And right in the middle of all this magnificence lived a young woman who was about to turn the ancient world completely upside down. Not with an army, well, not just with an army, with her brain, her charm, her absolutely unshakable belief in herself, and, let's be honest, a flair for the dramatic that would put any modern celebrity to shame. So settle in, my dear. Let the fire crackle, let your breathing slow, and let me tell you about the queen who loved so fiercely she was willing to lose everything, and the general who loved her right back. Consequences be damned. Part 1. The Princess Who Wouldn't Share. Cleopatra was born in the winter of 69 BC into what we might politely call a spectacularly dysfunctional family. The Ptolemies had been ruling Egypt for 300 years by that point, ever since one of Alexander the Great's generals had claimed it as his prize after Alexander died. They were Greek, not Egyptian. Greek blood, Greek customs, Greek language. For 3 centuries, they'd ruled Egypt without ever really becoming Egyptian. Her father was Ptolemy XII. The Egyptians had a nickname for him. They called him Auletes, the flute player. Now, you don't get a nickname like that by being a strong, commanding ruler who strikes fear into your enemies' hearts. No, you get that nickname by being weak and indecisive and more interested in playing music and drinking wine than actually governing. Ptolemy XII was terrible at his job, absolutely terrible. He drained the treasury, paying bribes to Rome to keep Egypt independent. He ignored his advisors. He let corruption run rampant. The Egyptian people couldn't stand him. His own family barely respected him. But young Cleopatra? She was watching, learning, taking notes on exactly how not to rule a kingdom. While her brothers and sisters played games in the palace gardens, little Cleopatra was studying. She'd slip away to the great library whenever she could. She'd sit there for hours, surrounded by scrolls, reading everything she could get her hands on. Philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, medicine, military strategy, history, poetry. The librarians loved her, this serious little girl with the intense eyes, always asking questions, always wanting to know more. She wasn't just memorizing facts, she was thinking, analyzing, understanding. And languages? Oh my goodness, the languages. Most princesses of her time might learn 2 or 3 languages if they were ambitious. Cleopatra learned 9. 9 different languages. Let me put that in perspective for you. Her family had ruled Egypt for 300 years, 3 centuries, and in all that time, not a single one of them had bothered to learn Egyptian. Not one. They spoke Greek at court, they wrote in Greek, they thought in Greek. The Egyptian people, the millions of actual Egyptians they ruled over, might as well have been speaking gibberish for all the Ptolemies cared. Can you imagine? It's like being the principal of a school for 30 years and never learning what language your students speak. Just absolutely absurd. But Cleopatra learned Egyptian. She learned it properly, fluently, with no accent. And when she spoke to the Egyptian people in their own language, they loved her for it. Finally, after 300 years, a ruler who could actually talk to them like a human being. She also learned Greek, obviously. That was her family language. Latin, because Rome was becoming more powerful every year, and you needed to understand Romans if you wanted to survive. Hebrew and Aramaic, the languages of Egypt's neighbors to the east. Ethiopian, Median, Parthian. She could conduct negotiations with Arabian merchants in their language, discuss philosophy with Greek scholars in theirs, charm Roman generals in perfect Latin. This girl, this teenager, could speak to anyone from anywhere in the known world in their own language. Imagine that kind of power. Imagine walking into any room, anywhere in the known world, and being able to communicate perfectly. But it wasn't just the languages. The ancient writers tell us she had something special, a quality that's hard to define. They said her voice was like music, that when she spoke, you couldn't help but listen, not because she was loud or forceful, but because she was captivating, magnetic. She studied rhetoric, too, the art of persuasion, how to construct an argument, how to make people see things your way, how to win debates, how to inspire loyalty. She practiced constantly, probably drove her tutors crazy asking questions and challenging their positions. She was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, sharp as a knife and just as dangerous if you crossed her. And she was going to need every bit of that brilliance, because when she was 18 years old, her father died, and according to his will, she was supposed to rule Egypt jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. Her brother was 10 years old. 10! Still a child, still playing with toys, probably still afraid of the dark, if we're being honest. Cleopatra took one look at this situation and thought, absolutely not. No way, not happening. She had not spent her entire childhood preparing to rule Egypt, studying until her eyes hurt, learning 9 languages and military strategy and political philosophy just to share power with a 10-year-old who could barely sit through a council meeting without fidgeting. But Egypt's advisors had different ideas. See, these were men who'd gotten very comfortable running things while Ptolemy XII drank and played his flute. They were the real power behind the throne, and they liked it that way. A 10-year-old boy? Perfect. Easy to control, easy to manipulate. They could whisper advice in his ear and he'd do whatever they said. Keep the throne as their puppet while they made the real decisions. An 18-year-old woman who'd read every military manual in the Great Library and spoke 9 languages and had very definite opinions about how Egypt should be run. Not so much. Not so much at all. So they made their move, started a whisper campaign, told young Ptolemy XIII that his sister was dangerous, that she wanted all the power for herself, that she was going to push him aside. They turned the boy against her, made him afraid of her. The situation escalated quickly. Within months, Cleopatra found herself being pushed out of the palace, out of Alexandria, out of Egypt entirely. The advisors declared that Ptolemy XIII would rule alone, with them as their loyal regents, of course, for his own good, for Egypt's good. They thought they'd won, thought they'd gotten rid of the troublesome princess who asked too many questions and had too many ideas. Big mistake. Huge. Cleopatra didn't go quietly into exile, didn't retire to some nice villa to write her memoirs and tend a garden. No, she went to Syria and started recruiting an army. That's right, this 19-year-old woman, exiled from her own kingdom, went and gathered soldiers, mercenaries, anyone willing to fight for her cause. She camped on Egypt's eastern border with her growing force and prepared to take back what was rightfully hers by force if necessary. Egypt teetered on the brink of civil war, brother against sister, the old advisors trying desperately to hold on to their power. And then into this mess walked the most powerful man in the world. Julius Caesar came to Egypt, and everything changed. Part 2. The man, the myth, the murder. Let me tell you about Julius Caesar. In 48 BC, he was 52 years old and at the absolute height of his power. He'd spent the last decade conquering Gaul, which is basically modern-day France, Belgium, and parts of Germany. He'd written books about his campaigns that became instant bestsellers in Rome. Everyone knew his name. Everyone had an opinion about him. He was tall for a Roman, handsome in that weathered military way, going bald but refusing to let it bother him. Smart, charismatic, ambitious beyond measure. The kind of man who looked at a map and saw opportunities, not boundaries. He'd been involved in a civil war with his rival, Pompey the Great. These had been friends once, even family. Pompey had been married to Caesar's daughter, but politics and ambition had turned them into enemies. They'd fought across the Mediterranean, Caesar's legions against Pompey's forces, in what was essentially a battle for control of the entire Roman world. Caesar won, decisively. At a place called Pharsalus in Greece, he crushed Pompey's army. Pompey, desperate and defeated, fled. He needed somewhere safe, somewhere to regroup and plan his next move. He chose Egypt. He'd helped Cleopatra's father years before, you see, had used his influence in Rome to support the old flute player's claim to the throne. Surely the current pharaoh would remember that debt. Surely they'd give him sanctuary. Pompey sailed to Egypt with what remained of his fleet. As his ship approached the shore near Alexandria, a small boat came out to meet him. Egyptian officials. They invited him to come with them, said the young pharaoh wanted to greet him properly. Pompey was suspicious. His wife, Cornelia, watching from the ship, begged him not to go. Something felt wrong. But what choice did he have? He needed Egypt's support. He got into the boat with a few of his men. They rowed toward shore, and as soon as they reached the beach, the Egyptians drew their swords and killed him, right there on the sand. Stabbed him to death while his wife watched from the ship screaming. They cut off his head, preserved it in a jar. thought they were being clever, thought Caesar would be grateful that they'd eliminated his enemy for him. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Julius Caesar arrived in Alexandria a few days later with a small force of soldiers, about 4,000 men. He was chasing Pompey, you see, wanted to capture him, maybe negotiate, maybe execute him properly according to Roman law. But he wanted to handle it himself, as a Roman, with dignity. When the Egyptians presented him with Pompey's severed head, expecting praise and gratitude, Caesar wept, openly wept. Yes, Pompey had been his enemy. Yes, they'd just fought a brutal civil war. But they'd been friends once, brothers-in-law. They'd shared meals and wine and stories. Caesar's beloved daughter had loved this man. And now he was reduced to a head in a jar, murdered like a common criminal by foreigners trying to curry favor. Caesar was furious, absolutely furious. He seized the royal palace in Alexandria, declared that as a representative of Rome, he would personally settle the dispute between young Ptolemy XIII and his exiled sister Cleopatra. He would decide who should rule Egypt. News of this spread through the city like wildfire, and across the border, in her camp with her army, Cleopatra heard it. And she knew this was her chance, her one chance. If she could get to Caesar, if she could plead her case directly to the most powerful man in the world, maybe she could win back her throne. But there was a rather significant problem. She was banned from Alexandria. Her brother's soldiers guarded every gate, every entrance to the city. They had orders to kill her on sight. And even if she somehow made it into the city, the palace was crawling with guards loyal to her brother and his advisors. They'd never let her through. She needed to be clever, needed to do something unexpected, something no one would anticipate. So she had herself smuggled into the palace, rolled up inside a carpet. I'm not making this up. This actually genuinely happened. Historical fact, recorded by multiple ancient writers. This brilliant, proud young queen who'd spent her entire life preparing to rule, scrunched herself up inside a rug like a piece of luggage. She recruited a merchant named Apollodorus, a Sicilian loyal to her cause. They waited until nightfall. Cleopatra wrapped herself in the carpet, curled up as tight as she could, and Apollodorus tied the whole thing with rope and slung it over his shoulder. Can you imagine how uncomfortable that must have been? Rolled up in scratchy wool or linen, unable to move, barely able to breathe, bouncing on someone's shoulder as they walked for over an hour, through the streets of Alexandria, past the guards. Apollodorus walked right up to the palace gates. The guards stopped him naturally. What was he carrying? A carpet for Caesar, he said casually, a gift from the finest weavers in Alexandria. The guards inspected it, poked at it a bit, but it was just a carpet, a big, expensive carpet. Romans loved expensive things. They waved him through. Apollodorus walked through the palace, through corridors lined with guards, upstairs, past more checkpoints. Finally found Caesar's private chambers. The guards there asked what he was delivering at this hour. A gift for the great Caesar, he said. He's had a difficult few days, thought he might appreciate something beautiful. They considered. Caesar did love luxury, and the man had just been presented with his former friend's severed head. Probably could use something to cheer him up. They let Apollodorus through. Caesar sat at a desk reviewing reports by lamplight, probably exhausted, probably annoyed at being stuck in Egypt dealing with this mess when he had an entire empire to run. Probably missing Rome and wondering how he'd gotten himself into this situation. Apollodorus entered, gave a respectful bow, and said he'd brought a gift. He set the carpet down on the floor and began to unroll it. Out tumbled Cleopatra, disheveled, her hair a mess, her clothes wrinkled, probably dizzy from being rolled up for so long. But there, standing in Julius Caesar's private chambers. This woman who'd just done something so bold, so clever, so completely unexpected. What kind of person does that? What kind of mind thinks of that and then actually goes through with it? Caesar stared, just stared. For a moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And then Cleopatra straightened up, smoothed her clothes as best she could, met Caesar's eyes, and began to speak. In perfect Latin, not a trace of an accent. She didn't apologize for her appearance, didn't make excuses, just launched into her case. She told him everything about her father's will, about her brother's incompetent advisors, about Egypt's history, its wealth, its importance to Rome, about why she should rule and why her brother couldn't. She was eloquent, passionate, intelligent. And Caesar listened. This man who'd heard every kind of plea imaginable, every kind of bribe, every kind of promise, every desperate ruler trying to save their throne. He'd heard it all, become jaded by it. But he'd never had anyone roll themselves up in a carpet just to talk to him. He was captivated. Here was this 21-year-old woman who'd just done something so bold, so clever, so completely unexpected. What kind of person does that? What kind of mind thinks of that and then actually goes through with it? They talked for hours about Egypt, about Rome, about politics and philosophy and power. Caesar found himself genuinely enjoying the conversation. When was the last time someone had challenged his thinking, made him see things from a new angle? She wasn't afraid of him, wasn't intimidated. She matched him thought for thought, idea for idea. By the end of the night, Caesar had made his decision. He would support Cleopatra's claim to the throne, would help her take back what was rightfully hers. And something else had happened too. Something neither of them had planned. They'd felt a connection, a spark. The 52-year-old conqueror and the 21-year-old exiled queen. They became lovers that night, and just like that, the fate of the ancient world shifted on its axis. Part 3. War, Love, and a Very Important Baby. Ptolemy XIII and his advisors were absolutely furious when they learned Caesar had sided with Cleopatra. They'd killed Pompey for him. They'd welcomed him to Egypt, given him a palace, and now he was sleeping with their enemy? Now he was threatening to put her back on the throne? This meant war. The Alexandrian War, historians call it now. It lasted for months. Egyptian forces besieged the palace where Caesar and Cleopatra had taken refuge with Caesar's small garrison of Roman soldiers. There were only about 4,000 Romans against tens of thousands of Egyptian troops. The odds were terrible. But Caesar was a military genius. Even trapped, even outnumbered, he was dangerous. He sent urgent messages to his allies for reinforcements. He defended the palace brilliantly, set traps, made clever sorties, kept the Egyptian forces off balance. At one point, Egyptian forces tried to trap the Roman fleet in the harbor. They came at night with fire ships, trying to burn Caesar's vessels. Caesar responded by setting fire to their ships. But the flames spread. The wind picked up. Buildings along the harbor caught fire. The flames spread further, faster. And the great library caught fire. Cleopatra watched from the palace as flames consumed parts of the building she'd spent her childhood in. The scrolls, thousands upon thousands of scrolls, centuries of accumulated knowledge, philosophy, science, mathematics, poetry, history, all of it burning, the smoke rising thick and black into the Egyptian sky. The ancient writers say she wept. stood at a window watching her world burn and cried like her heart was breaking. Because it was. All that knowledge, all that beauty gone. Caesar held her that night, promised her they'd rebuild it, that knowledge could be gathered again. But they both knew some of those scrolls had been unique, one of a kind, lost now forever. The war ground on. Caesar's reinforcements finally arrived, fresh Roman legions marching into Egypt. The tide turned. Caesar crushed the Egyptian forces. Ptolemy XIII tried to flee across the Nile. His boat, overloaded with panicking soldiers, capsized in the river. Weighed down by his golden armor, the boy drowned. He was 13 years old. Cleopatra felt no sorrow for her brother's death. He'd tried to have her killed, had stolen her throne, had chosen the wrong advisors. In the brutal world of Egyptian politics, he'd played and lost. Caesar declared Cleopatra the rightful pharaoh of Egypt. She married another younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, because Egyptian tradition demanded the pharaoh have a co-ruler. But everyone understood it was a formality, a name on official documents. Cleopatra held all the real power, at last. And then, several months after the war ended, Cleopatra made an announcement that would change everything. She was pregnant. There was no question who the father was. Julius Caesar, the conqueror of Gaul, the master of Rome, the most powerful man in the world. He'd gotten the Queen of Egypt pregnant. In July of 47 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to a son. She named him Ptolemy XV Philopator Caesar. Quite a mouthful. Everyone just called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. This child represented something extraordinary. He was half Roman, half Egyptian, the blood of two great civilizations running through his veins, a son who could potentially unite the Mediterranean world under one rule. Roman military might and Egyptian wealth and culture combined in one person. Caesar couldn't officially acknowledge him. Roman law was very specific about this. Marriages to foreigners didn't count. Children born of such unions were illegitimate, and Caesar already had a legal wife back in Rome, a woman named Calpurnia. Acknowledging Caesarion would create all sorts of legal and political problems. But privately? Privately, everyone knew. This was Caesar's son, his only son. Caesar had no other children except an adopted heir. Caesarion was his blood. Caesar eventually had to leave Egypt. Duty called. He had other wars to fight, other provinces to secure, a whole empire demanding his attention. But before he left, he did something extraordinary. He invited Cleopatra to come to Rome, to bring their son and live there. Now, this was shocking, absolutely shocking. Romans didn't do this. Foreign queens didn't come live in Rome. Mistresses stayed hidden, discreet. Children born outside legal marriage were kept quiet, shuffled off somewhere far away. But Caesar didn't care about convention. He set her up in a villa across the Tiber River, outside the city walls technically, but close, very close. Close enough that he could visit regularly. Close enough that everyone in Rome knew exactly what was going on. He installed her in luxury, gave her servants, guards, everything she could want, threw parties for her, introduced her to Roman high society, made it clear that Cleopatra wasn't just some foreign fling, she mattered to him. The Romans were scandalized, absolutely scandalized. Who was this Egyptian queen with her strange clothes and her exotic servants and her foreign customs living here in their city, raising Caesar's illegitimate son right under everyone's noses? Caesar had a legal Roman wife living in the city proper. How could he embarrass her this way? How could he embarrass Rome? The gossip was endless. The Senate murmured, the patrician families whispered, the common people watched with a mixture of fascination and horror. Some loved the drama, others were genuinely outraged. But Caesar? Caesar didn't care. He was in love. He showered Cleopatra with honors, had a golden statue of her placed in the temple of Venus Genitrix, the ancient temple of the Julian family. A golden statue of his Egyptian mistress in a sacred Roman temple. It was the ancient equivalent of posting couple photos all over social media, making your relationship status very, very public. Bold move, Caesar. Bold move indeed. For 2 years, this arrangement continued. Cleopatra lived in Rome, raising Caesarion, attending Caesar's parties, discussing philosophy and politics with the greatest minds of the Roman world. She became part of the social scene. Some people genuinely liked her, found her intelligent and charming. Others hated her on principle, a foreign queen corrupting good Roman values. And there were rumors, constant rumors. People whispered that Caesar planned to marry her, that he would change Roman law to allow it, that he would make her his queen, make Caesarion his official heir, that Rome would have an Egyptian queen and a half-Egyptian emperor. The rumors grew louder, more insistent. Caesar's behavior suggested they might be true. He was spending more and more time with Cleopatra, less and less time pretending to be a good Roman husband. Some people loved Caesar, thought he was the greatest leader Rome had ever known. Others feared he was becoming a tyrant, a king in all but name. Rome had fought to overthrow their kings 500 years ago. They prided themselves on being a republic, ruled by law, not by one man's whim. But Caesar seemed to be changing that, accumulating power, making decisions unilaterally, acting more like a monarch every day. A group of senators began to meet secretly, to discuss, to plan. They convinced themselves they were saving the Republic, saving Rome from tyranny. On March 15th, 44 BC, the Ides of March, Caesar went to the Senate for what he thought was a normal meeting, just another day of governance, boring speeches and administrative decisions. The conspirators were waiting. Over 60 senators involved in the plot. They'd all agreed Caesar had to die. As Caesar entered the Senate chamber, they surrounded him. Someone grabbed his toga, pulling it off his shoulder. The signal. They drew their daggers. 23 wounds, 23 stab wounds from 23 different senators. Caesar fought at first, trying to defend himself, but there were too many blades, too much blood. The ancient writers say his last words were in Greek. Looking at Marcus Brutus, a young senator he loved like a son, Caesar said, "Kai su teknon," you too, child. Then he fell. The great Julius Caesar, conqueror of Gaul, master of Rome, the most powerful man in the world, bleeding out on the floor of the Senate chamber. Cleopatra was still in Rome when it happened, probably heard the news within hours. The city erupted into chaos. The assassins thought they'd be hailed as heroes for saving the Republic. Instead, the common people rioted. Caesar had been popular with them. They loved him. And now he was dead. Cleopatra knew she was in danger. She was Caesar's mistress, the mother of his son, the foreign influence everyone had been blaming for his changes. The mob might come for her. The assassins might decide to eliminate anyone connected to Caesar. She packed up immediately, gathered Caesarion and her household, and fled. Got on a ship and sailed back to Egypt as fast as she could, back to safety, back to the only place where she had real power. She was heartbroken, devastated. Caesar had been her lover, her partner, her ally, the father of her child, the man who'd given her back her throne. And now he was gone, murdered by men who claimed to be patriots. Rome descended into chaos, civil war again. Caesar's assassins on one side, Caesar's supporters on the other, and somewhere in the middle, a cold, calculating 18-year-old named Octavian, Caesar's adopted heir, his grandnephew in blood, but adopted as his son in Caesar's will. Octavian versus the assassins, old supporters of Caesar versus new. It would take years to sort out, years of fighting and death and political maneuvering. Cleopatra returned to Alexandria and focused on what she could control, ruling Egypt, raising her son, mourning the man she'd lost. She executed her puppet brother husband Ptolemy XIV, had him poisoned. No point pretending anymore. She made Caesarion her co-ruler, made it official. The son of Caesar ruled Egypt alongside her. And she waited to see who would win Rome's civil war, waited to see who she'd have to deal with next. It took 3 years of battles and betrayals, but finally the dust settled. Caesar's supporters won, the assassins were defeated and killed. And Rome was ruled by a triumvirate, 3 men dividing power: Octavian, Caesar's heir; Lepidus, a competent but unambitious general; and Mark Antony, Caesar's best friend, his most loyal general. They divided the Roman world between them. Lepidus got Africa, Octavian got the West, and Antony got the East, all the wealthy provinces: Syria, Greece, Asia Minor, and Egypt. In 41 BC, 3 years after Caesar's death, Cleopatra received a summons. Mark Antony wanted to meet with her in the city of Tarsus in modern-day Turkey. Cleopatra prepared for the meeting carefully, very carefully, because she knew something important. She'd met Antony before, years ago, when he'd been a young cavalry officer in Egypt. He'd been handsome even then, charming, but young, insignificant. Caesar's friend, not someone important in his own right. But now he was one of the 3 most powerful men in the world. Now he controlled the eastern provinces. Now he was someone she needed to impress. And Cleopatra knew exactly how to make an impression. Part 4. The Entrance That Stopped a City. Mark Antony was 41 years old when he summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus. Tall, broad-shouldered, handsome in that weathered military way. A few gray hairs starting to show, but still strong, still vital. He'd been Caesar's right-hand man, had fought beside him in Gaul in the civil wars, had been one of the first to call for revenge after Caesar's assassination. He'd helped form the second triumvirate with Octavian and Lepidus. Together they defeated the assassins. Now they ruled Rome jointly, having carved up the Mediterranean world like a pie. Antony got the richest slice, the eastern provinces. But rich provinces needed money to maintain, armies to pay, fortifications to build, administration to fund, and Antony needed that money. Egypt was wealthy, legendarily wealthy, the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. Its fields produced grain that fed the entire region. Its treasury was still flush despite decades of careful spending under Cleopatra's rule. So Antony summoned her, expected her to come humbly, to acknowledge his power as Rome's representative in the East, to offer tribute, negotiate terms, beg for his favor. That is not what happened. Cleopatra took her time, let Antony wait, let him stew. She spent weeks preparing, planning every detail of her arrival, because she understood something fundamental about power. It's not just about armies and treasuries. It's about perception, about theater, about making people believe you're powerful, even when you're vulnerable. And when she finally arrived in Tarsus, she arrived in a way no one would ever forget. She came by river, the Cydnus River that flowed past Tarsus. And she didn't come on some simple transport ship. Oh no, she came on a barge. but calling it a barge doesn't do it justice. This was a floating palace. The hull was gilded with gold leaf that glinted in the sun. The prow was carved and painted to look like a fantastic creature from myth, colored in brilliant blues and golds. The sails were made of purple silk, purple, the most expensive dye in the ancient world, worth more than gold. Only royalty could afford purple. One sail of purple silk cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. Cleopatra had several. The oars were made of silver, actual silver, and they were arranged to beat in rhythm, all together, keeping time with flutes and harps and drums played by musicians on the deck. The whole ship moved like it was dancing down the river. Incense burned in golden braziers all over the deck, myrrh and frankincense and other exotic spices. The smoke drifted across the water, perfuming the entire harbor. People could smell her arrival before they could see it. And Cleopatra herself. She reclined under a canopy woven with gold thread, dressed as the goddess Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. She wore silk robes that would have cost a fortune, jewelry that would have ransomed a city. Her handmaidens were dressed as sea nymphs in flowing blue and green. Boys dressed as cupids with little wings attached to their backs fanned her with peacock feathers. The whole thing was absolutely, spectacularly, ridiculously over the top, like something out of a fever dream, like a goddess descending from Olympus to grace mortals with her presence. Word of her approach spread through Tarsus like wildfire. People ran to the river to see, dropped whatever they were doing and ran. Merchants abandoned their stalls, workers left their jobs, even officials left their posts. Everyone wanted to see the Queen of Egypt arrive. The crowds lined the riverbank, climbed trees for a better view, stood on rooftops. Thousands of people all craning their necks to see this spectacle. And Antony? He was sitting alone in the Forum, the public square, waiting for Cleopatra to come pay her respects. He'd set up his official chair, arranged his guards, prepared to receive her with proper Roman dignity. But his entire audience had left. Every single person who should have been there, filling the Forum, watching him receive the Egyptian queen, had gone to the river. They'd abandoned him to go watch her arrive. For a while, Antony sat there, probably getting angrier by the minute. He was Mark Antony, one of the 3 rulers of Rome, a great general, Caesar's best friend, and he was sitting alone in an empty forum like an idiot while everyone else watched some foreign queen put on a show. Finally, he gave up, went to the river himself to see what all the fuss was about. And when he saw that barge, saw Cleopatra reclining like a goddess with incense smoking around her and music playing and the whole impossible, magnificent spectacle of it, he understood immediately. This was power. This was money. This was a statement. Cleopatra wasn't coming to him as a supplicant. She was coming as an equal, maybe more than an equal. She was showing him exactly how wealthy Egypt was, how sophisticated, how far beyond rough Roman sensibilities. The barge docked. Antony expected Cleopatra to disembark and come greet him. That's what was supposed to happen. The ruler comes to the representative of Rome. Instead, she sent a messenger, an invitation. Would the great Antony do her the honor of dining on her barge that evening? Antony was supposed to say no. But he didn't. He went, curious, intrigued, maybe a little annoyed that she'd outmaneuvered him so completely, but impressed despite himself. The feast Cleopatra threw for him that night became legendary. People talked about it for years afterwards. Gold plates, not gold-plated, solid gold, goblets encrusted with jewels, foods Antony had never seen before, delicacies from across Egypt and beyond, whole fish from the Nile cooked in exotic spices, fruits from Ethiopia, honey-soaked desserts from Greece, wine from vineyards that supplied only the royal household. Entertainment beyond anything Antony had experienced, dancers moving like water, acrobats defying gravity, musicians playing instruments he didn't recognize, creating sounds he'd never heard. Fire eaters and jugglers, and poets reciting verses in Greek and Egyptian. The whole barge glowed with lamplight, hundreds of oil lamps, all lit at once, turning the vessel into a floating constellation. The light reflected off the water, making the whole harbor shimmer and dance. Now, Antony was a Roman general. He'd lived in military camps, ate soldiers' rations, slept on hard ground. Romans appreciated luxury, sure. They liked their baths and their wine and their fine togas. But Roman luxury was practical, functional, solid. What Cleopatra showed him was something else entirely. This was Eastern opulence, Egyptian extravagance, art and beauty and pleasure elevated to their absolute highest form. This was luxury as performance art. And Cleopatra herself, she was 28 years old now, 7 years older than when she'd met Caesar, more confident, more self-assured. She'd ruled Egypt successfully through war and peace. She'd borne a son. She'd navigated Roman politics. She wasn't the desperate, exiled princess anymore. She was a queen in the fullest sense of the word. She spoke to Antony in Latin, perfect Latin, with just enough of an accent to be charming. She was witty, made jokes, told stories, asked about his campaigns, listened to his answers with genuine interest, made him feel clever and important and fascinating. Antony was captivated, absolutely captivated. Here was this beautiful, intelligent, charming woman who commanded a wealthy kingdom and knew how to throw a party that made Roman banquets look like sad picnics, who spoke his language and laughed at his jokes and looked at him like he was the most interesting man in the world. He was done for, completely done for. He stayed in Egypt that winter. One season turned into months, months turned into years. He forgot about Rome, forgot about his duties and responsibilities, forgot about everything except Cleopatra. Together, they formed a private society, a club just for them and their closest friends. They called it the Inimitable Livers. The whole idea was to live life to the absolute fullest, to experience every pleasure, every joy, every sensation the world had to offer. They feasted every night, threw parties that lasted until dawn, hunted in the Egyptian desert, sailed up the Nile to see the ancient temples and pyramids, explored Alexandria in disguise, wearing common clothes, walking through the marketplaces like regular people, laughing at the fact that nobody recognized them. They gambled, played dice games with absurd stakes, told jokes and stories, debated philosophy, made love, spent entire days in bed just talking, about everything and nothing, about their pasts and their dreams and their fears. Cleopatra showed Antony her kingdom, the temples along the Nile with their massive columns and walls covered in hieroglyphs, the pyramids at Giza, already ancient when they stood before them, the great library, partially rebuilt after the fire, the schools where scholars studied astronomy and math and medicine. They spent hours in the library together, Cleopatra reading scrolls aloud, translating Egyptian texts into Greek for Antony, discussing what they read. Antony had never been much of a scholar, but with Cleopatra he found himself interested. She made everything fascinating. Antony had never met anyone like her. He'd known plenty of beautiful women, plenty of intelligent women, but Cleopatra was something else. She could discuss military strategy with the mind of a general, could debate philosophy with scholars and hold her own, could match him drink for drink, joke for joke, thought for thought, could rule a kingdom as effectively as any man. She was his equal, his partner, not a decoration or a possession, but a genuine partner. And he fell in love, deeply, completely, irrevocably in love. In 40 BC, Cleopatra gave birth to twins, a boy and a girl. She named them Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene. Helios, Selene, the sun and the moon, these grand mythological names for Antony's children. Antony acknowledged them publicly, proudly. These were his children, his son and daughter. He didn't hide them or pretend they didn't exist. He celebrated their birth. But here's where things get complicated, because Antony was married to a Roman woman named Fulvia, a powerful, ambitious woman who'd been his political partner back in Rome. And then Fulvia died, fell ill and died while Antony was in Egypt. And to maintain his political alliance with Octavian, Caesar's heir, Antony married Octavia's sister, a woman named Octavia. He married her in Rome, proper Roman wedding, legal and official, while Cleopatra waited in Egypt with their newborn twins. It was a political marriage, everyone understood that. Antony needed Octavian's support, needed the alliance to maintain his power in the East. Octavia was a pawn in their political chess game. But Antony kept returning to Cleopatra, would stay in Rome for a few months, handle business, then sail back to Egypt, back to Cleopatra, back to his real life. Because what he had with Cleopatra wasn't politics, wasn't strategy. It was love, real, genuine, can't live without you love. And back in Rome, a cold, calculating young man named Octavian was watching all of this, taking careful notes, gathering evidence, building a case, waiting for his moment. Part 5. When Rome turned against them. Octavian was brilliant at propaganda, absolutely brilliant. He was Caesar's adopted son, his heir, but he was nothing like Caesar. Where Caesar had been warm and charismatic and loved by the common people, Octavian was cold and calculating and politically precise. He didn't inspire love, he inspired respect, fear, obedience. He played the long game, patient, methodical, always thinking 3 moves ahead. And he hated what Antony was doing, or at least he found it incredibly useful to hate it. He started a propaganda campaign in Rome, painted Cleopatra as a foreign threat to the Republic, a witch who'd seduced Antony, turned him from a good Roman general into a slave of Egyptian decadence. He said she'd bewitched him with drugs and magic, that she planned to conquer Rome and make herself empress of the world. He spread rumors that Antony wasn't himself anymore, that the East had corrupted him, that Egyptian luxury had made him soft, that he cared more about foreign pleasures than Roman duty. Some of it was lies, pure invention. Some was exaggeration, taking small truths and blowing them out of proportion. But some of it was based on reality. Because Antony was spending years in Egypt, was having children with Cleopatra, was living more like an Egyptian prince than a Roman general. And Romans were starting to notice, starting to wonder, starting to worry. In 34 BC, Octavian made a decision that would prove catastrophic. He held a ceremony in Alexandria called the Donations of Alexandria. It was meant to be a celebration, a grand public display of his power and generosity. He gathered the people of Alexandria in the gymnasium, had golden thrones set up on a platform. He sat on the largest throne. Cleopatra sat beside him on another throne equally grand. Their children sat on smaller thrones around them. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the twins, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, their third child together, and Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, 13 years old now, sitting there in royal regalia. Then Antony made proclamations, formal official announcements about how he was dividing up the eastern territories. He declared Caesarion the true heir of Julius Caesar, not Octavian. Said Octavian was adopted, but Caesarion was Caesar's actual blood son. Therefore, Caesarion should be Caesar's heir. He gave Cleopatra the title Queen of Kings, made her ruler of Egypt, Cyprus, Libya, and Syria, vast territories under her control. He gave Alexander Helios territories to the east, Armenia, Media, Parthia, made his 3-year-old son a king. He gave Cleopatra Selene territories in North Africa, made his 3-year-old daughter a queen. He was essentially giving away Roman territories, lands Rome had conquered or controlled. He was handing them to an Egyptian queen and his half-Egyptian children. The ceremony was magnificent, theatrical, designed to show the world that Antony and Cleopatra were building something new, a new kind of empire, Roman power combined with Egyptian wealth, East and West united under their rule. But in Rome, people were horrified, absolutely horrified. How dare he? How dare this Roman general give away Roman lands to a foreign queen? How dare he declare that woman's son the heir Julius Caesar? How dare he put crowns on the heads of his illegitimate children? The Senate was in uproar. Roman citizens felt betrayed. Even Antony's supporters started to have doubts. This was going too far, way too far. Octavian seized the moment. He'd been waiting for Antony to make a mistake, and this was it. This was his opening. He launched a full-scale propaganda assault, painted Antony as a traitor, said Cleopatra had completely corrupted him, that he'd abandoned Rome for a foreign queen, that he planned to move the capital from Rome to Alexandria, that he would make Cleopatra empress and himself her consort. He didn't declare war on Antony directly. That would have been unpopular. Antony still had many supporters in Rome. Roman citizens didn't want to fight other Romans. So Octavian did something clever, something politically brilliant. He declared war on Cleopatra, made her the enemy, the foreign threat that needed to be eliminated, the Egyptian queen who'd corrupted a good Roman and threatened the Republic. This forced Antony to choose Rome or Cleopatra, his people or his heart, his duty or his love. Antony chose Cleopatra. He divorced Octavia, Octavian's sister, the woman he'd married to seal their alliance. He sent her back to Rome with a formal letter ending the marriage, made his choice public, undeniable, burned his bridges completely. He and Cleopatra would face Rome together. They gathered their forces, ships from Egypt and the eastern provinces, soldiers from across their territories, built an army and a navy to face Octavian. The ancient world held its breath. This was it, the showdown, Rome against Egypt, West against East, Octavian against Antony, the cold strategist against the passionate warrior, and at the heart of it all, a love story. Two people who'd chosen each other over everything else, who were willing to fight the most powerful military machine in history rather than be separated. In 31 BC, the two sides met. at a place called Actium off the coast of Greece, in what would become one of the most famous naval battles in history. Antony and Cleopatra commanded over 200 warships, large vessels, heavily armed, and thousands of soldiers. Octavian, with his brilliant Admiral Agrippa, commanded a slightly smaller fleet, but with faster, more maneuverable ships. The battle should have been close. Antony was an experienced general. He knew war, knew strategy. His forces were powerful. But something went wrong, terribly wrong. In the middle of the fighting, with the battle still undecided, Cleopatra's squadron suddenly broke away. Her ships, about 60 of them, raised their sails and fled south, heading back toward Egypt. And Antony, seeing her flagship leaving, seeing those purple sails catching the wind, made a choice. He abandoned his own fleet, left his men fighting, boarded a fast ship, and followed her. His officers were stunned. His soldiers couldn't believe it. Their general, their commander, had abandoned them in the middle of a battle to chase after a woman. Without Antony's leadership, without his tactical brilliance, the fleet fell apart. Some ships fought on bravely, but it was hopeless. Others surrendered. By nightfall, Octavian had won a complete and total victory. Why did Cleopatra flee? This is one of history's great mysteries. Some ancient writers say she panicked, saw the battle turning against them, and ran. Others claim it was a planned retreat, that Antony was supposed to break off with her, that they were trying to save at least part of their fleet and treasury to fight another day. Others suggest betrayal, though that seems unlikely. We'll never know the truth. What we do know is that Antony followed her. When he caught up to her ship, he didn't speak for 3 days, just sat in the prow, head in his hands, devastated by what they'd done, what they'd lost. They returned to Alexandria together, defeated, their dreams of empire in ruins, their armies mostly destroyed or deserted, their allies abandoning them one by one. And Octavian was coming. Everyone knew it. It was only a matter of time before he arrived to finish what he started. The end was coming, and they both knew it. Part 6. The Last Days. For nearly a year, Antony and Cleopatra lived in Alexandria, waiting for Octavian to arrive with his armies. They knew there was no escape, no way out, no miracle coming to save them. They dissolved their old club, the Inimitable Livers. The days of endless parties and joyful excess were over. They formed a new club instead. They called it the Synapusimimenoi, the Partners in Death. A grim name for grim times, but they faced it together, held each other at night, tried to find moments of peace and happiness even as their world crumbled around them. Cleopatra spent time in her private laboratories. She'd always been interested in medicine, in poisons, in the properties of different substances. Now she had a very practical reason to study them. She tested poisons on prisoners condemned to death anyway, watching carefully to see which were fastest, which were most painless, planning, preparing. She wanted to be ready. If capture looked inevitable, if torture or humiliation seemed certain, she wanted an escape, a way out on her own terms. Antony tried to rally his remaining forces, drilled his soldiers, prepared defenses around Alexandria, but every day more men deserted, slipped away in the night to join Octavian's approaching army. The writing wasn't just on the wall, it was lit up in flames. They threw parties still, desperate, defiant parties, trying to prove they weren't afraid, trying to hold on to some semblance of their old life. They drank too much wine, laughed too loudly, made love desperately, clinging to each other like drowning people clutching at hope. In August of 30 BC, Octavian's armies finally arrived outside Alexandria. The waiting was over. Antony led his remaining men out to face them, his last battle, his last chance to die like a Roman general should die, in combat, with honor, with his sword in his hand. But even that was taken from him. He stood on the walls of Alexandria and watched his cavalry ride out to engage Octavian's forces. And then, as they got close, they turned, went over to Octavian's side, joined his army. Then his infantry marched out, and they too switched sides, just walked over and surrendered. Then his fleet, what little remained of it, sailed out of the harbor, and without firing a single shot, they surrendered to Octavian's ships. Antony stood there and watched his entire army betray him. Everything he'd built, everyone he'd trusted, gone in a matter of hours. He returned to the palace, shattered, broken, and there someone brought him news, a messenger, breathless and urgent. Cleopatra was dead. She'd killed herself. For Antony, something inside just snapped. Without Cleopatra, what was the point? What was any of it for? All the fighting, all the struggling, all the losses, they'd only been bearable because she was with him, because they faced it together. And now she was gone. He asked his bodyguard, his loyal servant, Eros, to kill him, to grant him a quick, clean death, a mercy. Eros had sworn to do this if the time ever came, but Eros couldn't do it, couldn't bring himself to kill the man he'd served for years, the general he'd followed across the world. So instead, Eros drew his own sword and killed himself, fell dead at Antony's feet. Antony looked at his servant's body, at this final act of loyalty, this sacrifice, and knew what he had to do. He took his own sword, the sword he'd carried through Gaul with Caesar, the sword he'd carried in 100 battles. He positioned the point against his stomach, below his ribs, and he fell forward onto it. The wound was mortal, fatal, but not quick. The sword went through his abdomen, a slow, agonizing injury. He collapsed, bleeding, dying, but not dead. And then another messenger burst in, running, frantic. Cleopatra wasn't dead. The earlier message had been wrong. She'd locked herself in her mausoleum, the tomb she'd been building for safety, but she was alive. Antony, dying, started laughing, or maybe crying. Hard to tell. The cruelty of it, the cosmic joke. He'd killed himself because she was dead, and she wasn't. But it didn't matter now. The wound was fatal. He was dying whether he wanted to or not. He demanded to be carried to her, to see her one last time. His men picked up this great general, this man who'd commanded legions, and carried him through the streets of Alexandria to Cleopatra's mausoleum. Cleopatra looked out from a high window, saw them coming, saw Antony covered in blood, barely conscious. She wanted to come down, to open the doors and hold him, but Octavian's soldiers were everywhere searching for her. If she opened the doors, they'd capture her, and she knew what Octavian planned, knew he wanted her alive for his triumph. So she and her 2 handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, who'd been with her through everything, lowered ropes from the window, thick ropes tied to pillars inside, and they hauled Antony up. This dying man, this general who'd ruled half the Roman world, they pulled him up the side of the building, through the window, into the tomb. Cleopatra held him, cradled him in her arms, this man she'd loved for over a decade, who'd given up everything for her, who'd chosen her over Rome, over power, over his own life. He died there in her arms, whispering her name, telling her he loved her, that it had all been worth it. Mark Antony, 43 years old, dead of a self-inflicted wound in an Egyptian tomb, as far from a glorious Roman death as you can imagine. Cleopatra held his body and wept, truly wept, not delicate tears, but raw, broken sobbing, the kind of grief that tears you apart. She knew what came next, knew Octavian would come for her now, and she knew exactly what he planned. But she wasn't going to give him the satisfaction, wasn't going to be his trophy, his proof of victory. She was a queen, and she would die as a queen. Part 7. The Last Pharaoh. Octavian's soldiers found Cleopatra in her mausoleum shortly after Antony died. They didn't hurt her. Octavian had given very specific orders. He wanted her alive, wanted her healthy enough to walk in his triumph back in Rome. You see, Roman generals who won great victories were granted triumphs. Massive victory parades through Rome. The general would ride in a chariot wearing a purple toga while the whole city turned out to watch. They'd display the spoils of war, the captured treasures, the exotic animals, and the prisoners, important prisoners from the defeated enemy, walking in chains. Octavian wanted Cleopatra for his triumph, the Queen of Egypt in chains, walking behind his chariot, proof of his greatness, proof that he'd succeeded where even Caesar had failed, by defeating the woman who'd supposedly bewitched Caesar himself. It would be the ultimate humiliation, this proud queen paraded through Rome's streets while crowds jeered and mocked, while children threw rotten fruit, while Romans celebrated her defeat. Cleopatra knew this, understood exactly what Octavian had planned. She'd lived in Rome for 2 years, had seen triumphs, knew how prisoners were displayed, how they were treated. She would not allow it, would not give Octavian that satisfaction, would not end her days as entertainment for Roman crowds. She was kept under guard in the mausoleum, not imprisoned exactly, but watched. Soldiers at every entrance, servants allowed in but supervised. She was treated well, fed, allowed to bathe and dress. Octavian wanted her presentable for his triumph. Cleopatra negotiated with Octavian through messengers, asked for one thing, one final request, to be buried with Antony, to spend eternity with the man she loved. Octavian agreed. Perhaps he felt some small measure of mercy. Perhaps he thought she'd given up, that she'd accepted her fate. Perhaps he genuinely didn't think she'd do anything drastic. After all, his guards were watching her constantly. He underestimated her, badly. Cleopatra spent her last days carefully. She bathed, taking her time, let her handmaidens wash and perfume her. Then she dressed herself in her finest royal robes, the full ceremonial dress of the pharaohs, white linen pleated perfectly, still holding its shape despite everything. The broad collar of gold and precious stones heavy around her neck, her crown, the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt, symbol of 3,000 years of pharaonic power. She put on her rings, her bracelets, her anklets, every piece of royal jewelry she owned. She looked at herself in the polished bronze mirror. She looked like a pharaoh, like the ruler she'd been for 22 years, every inch a queen. She wrote one final letter to Octavian, short and direct. She asked him again to honor his promise, to bury her with Antony. She wanted it in writing, wanted to make sure he'd keep his word. Then she sealed it and sent it with a trusted messenger. She ordered her last meal, told the guards she wanted something from outside the city, fresh fruit from the countryside. They thought it odd, but allowed it. Why not? The woman was about to spend months in captivity, followed by public humiliation. Let her have some fruit. A basket arrived, fresh figs from the Nile Delta, beautiful, ripe, sweet figs, one of Egypt's finest products. The guards inspected it carefully, poked through the figs, saw nothing suspicious, just fruit. They let it through. What they missed was hidden beneath the figs, wrapped carefully in leaves. A small snake, an asp, the Egyptians called it, the Egyptian cobra, a small one, perhaps 18 inches long, venomous, very venomous, but sacred to the Egyptian gods, the symbol of royalty, the uraeus. Every pharaoh's crown bore the image of the cobra, representing divine protection and royal power. Cleopatra dismissed everyone except for her two most loyal handmaidens, Iris and Charmian. These two women had been with her for decades, had served her through exile and triumph, through war and peace, through love and loss. They'd pulled Antony up through the window to die in her arms. They'd been there for everything. Cleopatra looked at these women, these friends, these sisters in all but blood, and she asked them a question. She didn't have to spell it out. They knew what she was planning. They could leave, could save themselves. Octavian would punish them, perhaps, but probably not kill them. They were just servants, not important enough to execute. Or they could stay, could face what came next together. They chose to stay. The three women sat together. Cleopatra opened the basket, reached in past the figs, found the snake. What happened next we can only piece together from evidence and later accounts. When Octavian received Cleopatra's letter and read her final request about being buried with Antony, he suddenly understood, realized what she was planning to do. He sent guards running to the mausoleum immediately, screaming at them to hurry, to stop her. But they were too late, just minutes too late. When the soldiers burst through the doors, they found all three women dead. Cleopatra lay on a golden couch, arranged carefully. She wore her full royal regalia. Her crown sat perfectly on her head, slightly tilted to one side, but still in place. Her hands were folded across her chest. Her eyes were closed. Her face peaceful. She looked like she was sleeping, like a pharaoh lying in state, beautiful even in death, serene, dignified. Iris lay dead at the foot of the couch. Charmian was still barely alive, kneeling beside Cleopatra, adjusting her crown with trembling hands, making sure everything was perfect, making sure her queen looked the way a queen should look. One of the soldiers, furious and frustrated, shouted at her, asked her if this was fitting, if this was how a queen should die, if this was honorable. Charmian looked at him, used her last breath, her last moment of life, and said yes. Yes, it was entirely fitting for a queen descended from so many kings, for the last pharaoh of Egypt, for the last pharaoh of Egypt. Then she collapsed next to Cleopatra and died. The soldiers found two small puncture marks on Cleopatra's arm just above the elbow, the bite of the asp. The venom worked quickly. The ancient Egyptian priests had studied these snakes for thousands of years, knew their properties, knew exactly what they did. The bite caused rapid paralysis, then stopped the heart. But gently, peacefully. They said it was like falling asleep, that you felt cold, then numb, then nothing, that it was one of the gentlest ways to die. Some modern historians debate whether it really was a snake. Maybe it was poison she'd prepared, maybe something else. But the snake makes symbolic sense. The uraeus, the cobra, the symbol of pharaonic power. Cleopatra claiming her right to die as a pharaoh, not as a Roman prisoner. She was 39 years old, had ruled Egypt for 22 years, had loved two of the most powerful men in history, had borne 4 children, had commanded armies and navies, had spoken 9 languages, had been one of the most intelligent, capable rulers of her age. And she chose her own death on her own terms, in her own way, as a queen. Octavian kept his word. He buried her next to Mark Antony, somewhere in Alexandria. The exact location of that tomb has been lost. Earthquakes and time and the rising Mediterranean waters have swallowed much of ancient Alexandria. Archaeologists have searched for it for a century. Maybe someday it will be found. Two lovers, still together after 2,000 years, still holding each other in the darkness. But the story doesn't quite end there, because there were children, the casualties of their parents' impossible love. Caesarion, Cleopatra's eldest son by Julius Caesar, was 17 years old. He tried to flee Egypt when his mother died. His advisors told him to run east, to India perhaps, where Roman power didn't reach, where he might survive, where he might someday return and reclaim his birthright. He made it as far as the Red Sea before Octavian's soldiers caught him. They brought him back to Alexandria, and Octavian had him executed, murdered. A 17-year-old boy killed because of who his parents were, because he represented a potential threat, because as long as Caesar's biological son lived, Octavian's claim to be Caesar's true heir was questionable. One of Octavian's advisors reportedly told him, 2 Caesars are one too many. So Caesarion died, the last living child of Julius Caesar, the boy who might have united Rome and Egypt, the prince who represented the possibility of something new and different. Gone, erased, eliminated. Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the 10-year-old twins, and Ptolemy Philadelphus, their 6-year-old brother, were spared. They were too young to be seen as real threats, too young to execute without looking monstrous. So Octavian took them back to Rome as prizes, living proof of his victory. He held his triumph, the biggest, most spectacular victory parade Rome had ever seen, and he paraded Cleopatra's children through the streets. They walked in golden chains, real gold, because Octavian wanted to show off Egypt's wealth. Behind them, soldiers carried a huge statue of Cleopatra with the asp wrapped around her arm. The conquered queen, the defeated enemy. The Roman crowds cheered and jeered, mocked the children of the woman who'd dared to challenge Rome, who'd corrupted Mark Antony, who'd almost brought their world to its knees. The children walked through that hostile crowd with their heads up, proud, defiant, refused to cry or show fear, their mother's children through and through. After the triumph, Octavian gave the 3 children to his sister Octavia, Antony's former wife, the woman Antony had divorced to be with Cleopatra. You'd think she would hate them. They were living proof of her husband's betrayal, of his love for another woman, of her humiliation. But Octavia was kind, gentle. She raised Alexander, Cleopatra, and Ptolemy alongside her own daughters by Antony, gave them a good education, a comfortable life, treated them well. She understood something important. These were children, innocent victims of their parents' choices. They deserved kindness, not punishment. Alexander Helios disappears from historical records after that. We don't know what happened to him. Perhaps he died young from illness. Perhaps he lived quietly somewhere, his name unrecorded. The Sun Prince vanished like sunset, gone without trace. Ptolemy Philadelphus also fades from history, too young to have left much mark, lost to time. But Cleopatra Selene survived. She grew up in Rome, received a Roman education alongside Octavia's daughters, learned Latin and Greek and rhetoric, studied philosophy and mathematics, her mother's daughter in intelligence and capability. When she was old enough, Octavian arranged a marriage for her to Juba II, the king of Mauritania. Mauritania was a Roman client kingdom in North Africa, roughly modern-day Morocco and western Algeria. Juba himself was another child of defeated enemies raised in Rome after his father lost a war to Julius Caesar. Two children of conquered kingdoms married to each other, sent to rule a kingdom under Roman supervision. But Cleopatra Selene made something of it. She became a real queen, not just a figurehead, but a ruler. She governed alongside her husband, had children, built libraries and temples, consciously echoing her mother's Alexandria, patronized scholars and artists. Some of her coins survive. They show her profile with the inscription, Queen Cleopatra. She used her mother's name, carried that legacy proudly. She ruled for over 20 years, successfully, competently, and when she died, her son inherited the kingdom, a piece of Cleopatra living on, a fragment of that great love story producing something good, something lasting. As for Mark Antony, Octavian tried to erase him completely, had his name chiseled off monuments all over Rome, his statues pulled down and destroyed, declared officially that no member of the Antonius family could ever be named Marcus again. Tried to turn him into a non-person, a ghost, a cautionary tale about what happens when you betray Rome for a foreign queen. It didn't work. You can't erase someone that important, someone that connected to such an extraordinary story. The poets remembered, the historians wrote about him, and over centuries the propaganda faded. People began to see him not as a traitor, but as a man who made a choice, who chose love over power, who paid the ultimate price for that choice. Octavian became Augustus, the first emperor of Rome, ruled for 41 years, brought peace and prosperity to the empire, built Rome into something magnificent, made it the center of the world, was worshipped as a god in his lifetime. He won everything, absolutely everything. The whole Mediterranean world bowed to him. But even he never forgot Cleopatra. Years after her death, when he was old and gray and secure in his absolute power, people would ask him about his greatest enemies, about the closest calls, the times he'd almost lost. And Augustus, the great emperor, would mention her, would admit that Cleopatra had been the most dangerous enemy he'd ever faced, not because of her armies, which he'd crushed, not because of her wealth, which he'd seized, but because of something else, something harder to define. Her intelligence, her charisma, her ability to make powerful men love her so completely they would abandon everything. That was the real threat, not military might, not political alliances, but love, the kind of love that makes you willing to lose the world. Egypt became a Roman province, a possession, personal property of the emperor, so valuable it couldn't be entrusted to the Senate. Its grain fed Rome for centuries. Its wealth filled Roman treasuries. The Ptolemaic dynasty, 300 years old, ended with Cleopatra. She was the last pharaoh, the last independent ruler Egypt would have for nearly 2,000 years. The line of pharaohs, stretching back 3,000 years to the first kings who united Upper and Lower Egypt, ended with a woman who chose love over survival, who chose dignity over surrender, who refused to be anyone's prize or trophy or cautionary tale. The ancient Egyptians believed something beautiful. They believed that to speak a person's name was to make them live again, that as long as someone remembered you, said your name, told your story, you weren't truly dead. You existed still, somewhere, in memory and word and story. That was their version of immortality. By that measure, Cleopatra and Mark Antony have never died. Their names have been spoken every single day for 2,000 years, in every language, in every corner of the world. Their story told and retold again, painted and sculpted, written and performed, adapted and reimagined. Shakespeare wrote plays about them, multiple plays. Countless artists painted them. Poets composed verses about them. They're in movies and books and songs and operas. Every generation rediscovers them. Every generation finds something new in their story. Because everyone understands it. Everyone recognizes it. That love that changes everything, that makes you willing to risk it all. Even if most of us never experience it ourselves, we know it when we see it. We're fascinated by it, drawn to it, made to wonder what it would be like. So there it is, my dear, the complete story, from beginning to end. From the clever princess rolled up in a carpet to the queen dying with a crown on her head. From the golden barge at Tarsus to the tomb in Alexandria, from the heights of power to the depths of loss, from empire-shaking love to tragic, defiant death. It's been called many things over the centuries: a love story, a tragedy, a cautionary tale, a political drama, a story of ambition and folly, and it's all of those things. But mostly, I think, it's a story about choice. Cleopatra could have been practical at any point, could have negotiated, could have compromised, could have saved herself. When Caesar died, she could have stayed quiet in Egypt. When Antony summoned her, she could have played it safe. When Rome turned against them, she could have abandoned Antony and made peace with Octavian. When Octavian captured her, she could have accepted captivity and lived. But she chose differently. Every single time she chose differently, chose to fight for her throne, chose to partner with the most powerful men in the world, chose to love Antony openly, publicly, completely, chose to fight Rome itself rather than give him up, chose death over humiliation. And Antony, he could have stayed in Rome, could have been a loyal member of the triumvirate, could have honored his marriage to Octavia, could have kept Cleopatra as a secret, a foreign affair nobody talked about, could have walked away when Octavian declared war, could have abandoned her at Actium and rallied his fleet. But he chose her, again and again and again, chose her over duty, over honor, over Rome itself, chose to spend his years with her rather than accumulating more power, chose to die for her rather than live without her. Were they foolish? Maybe, probably. Historians and moralists have certainly said so for 2,000 years. Look at what they lost. Look at what their love cost them, their kingdoms, their children's futures, their very lives. All of it gone because they couldn't walk away from each other. But they had something that most people never find, not even for a day. That absolutely consuming, world-shaking, burn everything else down kind of love. The kind poets spend their lives trying to capture in words. The kind people dream about and rarely find. And they had it for over 10 years. 10 years of genuine partnership, of passion that never faded, of choosing each other every single day. They had children together, laughed together, ruled together, built dreams together as the world tried to tear them apart. Yes, it ended in tragedy. Yes, they lost everything. But they had those years. They knew what it felt like to love someone so much you'd give up the world. To be loved so completely in return, to find someone who matched you thought for thought, dream for dream, choice for choice. How many people live their whole lives and never feel that, never find someone they would cross oceans for, someone they would face death beside, someone they would choose over and over, no matter what it cost? Most of us love carefully, safely. We calculate, we compromise, we make practical choices. We choose security over passion, stability over dreams. And maybe that's wise. Maybe that's how you build a long, comfortable life. But Cleopatra and Antony chose differently. They loved recklessly, dangerously, completely. They burned bright and hot, and they burned out young. But oh, my dear, what a flame! What an incredible, beautiful, terrible flame! Their kingdoms fell, their names were cursed, their enemies triumphed. But their love became immortal, truly immortal, in a way Octavian's carefully built empire could never be. 2,000 years later, we remember their names. We tell their story. We try to understand what they had. Every generation rediscovers them and falls in love with their story all over again. People who couldn't tell you anything else about ancient history, who don't know Octavian's real name or when the Roman Empire fell, they know Cleopatra and Antony. Because everyone understands what they had. Everyone recognizes that kind of love, even if we've never experienced it ourselves. We're drawn to it, fascinated by it, made to wonder and dream and wish. And somewhere, perhaps, in whatever lies beyond death, they're still together, still holding each other, still choosing each other the way they did in life, over and over, forever and ever. The queen and the general, the Pharaoh and the Roman, two people who loved each other enough to lose everything. And if you could somehow reach across the centuries and ask them, I think they would tell you the same thing. It was worth it. Every moment, every sacrifice, every loss, it was worth it to have that kind of love, even for just a little while, even if it cost them the world. Because they had each other, and for them, that was everything. And now, my dear sweet child, the story is complete. From that first clever carpet entrance to the last breath in the tomb. The whole impossible, tragic, beautiful story of Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Close your eyes now. Let yourself drift. Let the fire burn low and the world fade away. Think of the Nile flowing quietly under the stars. Think of two people holding each other as empires crumbled around them. Think of love that refused to surrender, not to armies, not to empires, not even to death itself. Tomorrow there will be other stories, other times and places, other loves that shook the world. But for tonight, rest with this one. Let it settle in your heart like a warm blanket. Dream of courage, dream of passion, dream of love that asks for everything and gives everything in return. Dream of choosing someone so completely that nothing else matters. Sleep well, my darling. Sleep deeply and peacefully, and know that love like that existed once. Perhaps it exists still, somewhere. Perhaps it always will, as long as someone remembers to tell the story. As long as someone speaks their names. Cleopatra and Mark Antony. Good night, my dear. Sweet dreams. Rest well until morning.